The walls rise in layers of stone against the horizon, stretching across the land like a final line between two worlds. For centuries they have held against armies, against time, against the collapse of empires around them. From a distance, Constantinople still appears untouchable. Its towers stand firm, its domes catch the morning light, and at its heart, the vast structure of Hagia Sophia glows beneath the sky. Inside the city, life continues. Markets open, prayers are spoken, and the rhythm of daily existence moves forward as it always has. Yet beyond the hills, something is gathering. An army unlike any the city has faced before is preparing to test those walls. And for the first time in generations, the question is no longer whether Constantinople can survive, but how long it can hold. In the year 1453, Constantinople stood as the last remnant of an empire that had once dominated the eastern Mediterranean. The Byzantine Empire, heir to the legacy of Rome, had been reduced over centuries of conflict, division, and external pressure. What remained was no longer a vast territory, but a single city and its immediate surroundings. Yet this city carried a weight far greater than its size. It was a bridge between continents, positioned at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, controlling the narrow passage of the Bosporus, where trade and movement between worlds converged. For over 1,000 years, Constantinople had been more than a capital. It had been a symbol of endurance. Its survival through countless sieges had given it a reputation of invincibility. The Theodosian walls, constructed in the 5th century, were among the most formidable defensive structures ever built. Layers of stone, reinforced with towers and trenches, created a barrier that had stopped enemies again and again. To approach these walls was to confront history itself, a reminder that this city had outlasted everything that had tried to destroy it. Inside the walls, Constantinople was a city shaped by centuries of continuity and change. Its streets wound through districts that reflected layers of its past. Roman foundations, Byzantine churches, markets that had operated for generations. Stone houses stood close together, their walls bearing the marks of time. Narrow alleys connected neighborhoods, leading toward open squares where trade and social life intersected. Though the population had declined from its peak, the city still held a sense of purpose, a quiet resilience that had carried it through difficult times before. At the center of the city stood Hagia Sophia, its massive dome rising above the skyline as both an architectural and spiritual achievement. For centuries, it had been the heart of religious life, its interior filled with light that filtered through high windows, illuminating mosaics that depicted scenes of faith and empire. The building was not only a place of worship, it was a statement of identity, a reflection of a civilization that had once defined the region. Around it, smaller churches and monasteries formed a network of religious life that extended throughout the city. Markets still operated, though not with the same scale as in earlier centuries. Traders sold goods brought from surrounding regions, grain, oil, textiles, sustaining a population that relied on both local production and external supply. The harbors along the Golden Horn remained active, though quieter than in the city's golden age. Ships still arrived, carrying goods and information from distant lands, connecting Constantinople to the wider world even as its political power diminished. But beneath this appearance of continuity, the reality was changing. The city's defenses, though still strong, were no longer supported by the vast resources of an empire. The population was smaller. The army was limited. The ability to respond to a large-scale threat had been reduced over time. Constantinople still carried the memory of strength, but its present was fragile. Beyond its walls, a new power had risen. The Ottoman Empire, expanding steadily across Anatolia and southeastern Europe, had grown into a force capable of challenging the last remnants of Byzantine control. Under the leadership of Sultan Mehmed II, the Ottomans were not only expanding, they were focused. Constantinople was not just another city. It was the prize that would define an empire, a gateway between continents, and a symbol of legitimacy that carried immense significance. Mehmed's ambition was clear, and his preparations reflected it. The Ottoman forces gathered in large numbers, bringing with them not only soldiers but engineers, builders, and new technologies that would change the nature of warfare. Among these were massive cannons designed specifically to breach the city's walls. These weapons represented something new, an evolution in siege tactics that challenged the very foundations of Constantinople's defense. For centuries, the walls had been enough. Now they would be tested in a way they had never been before. Inside the city, the scale of the threat was understood. Emperor Constantine VII, the last ruler of the Byzantine Empire, prepared as best he could. Repairs were made to the walls, supplies were gathered. Defenders were organized, including both local soldiers and foreign volunteers who had come to support the city. Yet even with these efforts, the imbalance was clear. The defenders were vastly outnumbered, facing an army that was not only larger but equipped with new tools of war. And still, the walls stood. The memory of past victories remained strong. Constantinople had survived sieges before many times. It had resisted armies that seemed unstoppable. This history created a sense of belief, a conviction that the city could endure once again. But this time was different. The forces gathering outside the city were not temporary, and the technology they brought with them introduced a new kind of threat. As the Ottoman army moved closer, the landscape around Constantinople began to change. Camps were established. Positions were secured. The city, once connected to the world around it, began to feel isolated. The space beyond the walls, once part of daily life, now belonged to an advancing force that was preparing for something final. Inside, life continued, but it carried a different weight. Every action, every decision was shaped by the awareness that something was approaching. The markets still opened, the churches still held services, people moved through the streets as they always had. Yet beneath this surface, a quiet tension had begun to settle over the city. Constantinople still stood, but for the first time in centuries, its future was uncertain. And as the Ottoman forces completed their preparations beyond the walls, the city entered the final days of a story that had lasted for over 1,000 years. The first sound was not the clash of swords, but the deep, echoing thunder of cannon fire rolling across the land. It struck the walls with a force Constantinople had never experienced before. For centuries, those walls had been enough layered stone, reinforced towers, a system designed to outlast any army. But now, each impact sent vibrations through the city itself, a signal that something fundamental had changed. The siege had begun, and with it came a new kind of warfare, one that would not rely on speed, but on pressure, repetition, and time. Outside the walls, the Ottoman army moved with deliberate precision. Their camps stretched across the landscape, organized and sustained by a system built for endurance. Soldiers rotated through positions. Engineers adjusted the placement of massive cannons, carefully calibrating each shot to weaken specific sections of the wall. These weapons, unlike anything used in previous sieges, did not need to overwhelm the city in a single moment. They only needed to continue. Inside Constantinople, the rhythm of life shifted immediately. The city did not fall into chaos. It adapted. Defenders moved to reinforce damaged areas of the wall, working through the night to repair cracks and rebuild sections that had been weakened during the day. Stone was replaced, supports were added, and defenses were reorganized as quickly as possible. The cycle became constant: bombardment, repair, waiting, and then bombardment again. It was a battle not only of strength but of endurance. The defenders, though vastly outnumbered, held their positions with discipline. They understood the terrain, the structure of the walls, and the importance of each section. Foreign volunteers, particularly from Western Europe, stood alongside Byzantine soldiers, forming a defense that relied on coordination rather than numbers. For a time, this was enough. The walls, though damaged, did not immediately collapse. Constantinople resisted, as it always had, but the pressure did not ease. With each passing day, the damage accumulated. Sections of the outer wall began to weaken in ways that could not be fully repaired. The cannons, firing repeatedly, created fractures that spread through the stone. What had once been an impenetrable barrier began to show signs of vulnerability. And outside, the Ottoman forces adjusted their strategy. They did not rely solely on bombardment. Siege towers were constructed, rising high enough to challenge the height of the walls. Trenches were dug. Ramps were built, slowly pushing closer to the city's defenses. The attack was not a single action, it was a system, layered and persistent, designed to close every possible advantage the city still held. The sea, once a critical defense, was also brought into the struggle. Constantinople had long relied on its position along the Golden Horn, protected by a massive chain that blocked enemy ships from entering. For centuries, this barrier had ensured control over the harbor. But the Ottomans adapted. In a move that redefined the siege, they transported ships over land, bypassing the chain entirely. When those ships appeared within the Golden Horn, the city's sense of security shifted. The defense was no longer limited to the land walls. Constantinople was now under pressure from multiple directions. Inside the city, the psychological impact deepened. The knowledge that the enemy could adapt, that traditional defenses could be bypassed, began to change how the siege was understood. It was no longer a question of holding the walls, it was a question of how long the entire system could endure. Resources became more carefully controlled. Food supplies were rationed. The population, already reduced from earlier centuries, now faced the reality of a prolonged siege. Yet even as conditions grew more difficult, the structure of the city did not collapse immediately. Religious life continued. Processions moved through the streets. Prayers were offered in Hagia Sophia, where the vast interior still held its sense of calm and permanence. For many, faith became a source of strength, a way to maintain order in a situation that was increasingly uncertain. But beneath this outward continuity, pressure was building. The defenders were growing exhausted. The constant need to repair, defend, and remain alert took its toll. Each day required more effort than the last. And outside, the Ottoman army showed no signs of weakening. Their numbers remained strong. Their strategy remained consistent. They did not need to rush. They only needed to continue applying pressure. Small breaches began to appear in the walls' areas where the damage was too great to fully restore. These were defended intensely, becoming focal points of conflict. The fighting at these sections was direct, immediate, and costly. Yet even as the defenders held these points, the overall condition of the walls continued to decline. Time, once the city's greatest advantage, had shifted. It was no longer something that worked in Constantinople's favor. Each passing day strengthened the position of the besieging army while weakening the city within. The balance that had once defined the siege defense versus attack was slowly tipping in one direction. Inside Constantinople, this shift was felt, even if it was not always spoken. The memory of past victories remained, but it was no longer enough to guarantee confidence. The nature of the siege was different. The tools were different. The scale was different. And yet, the city still held. The walls, though damaged, had not fully fallen. The defenders, though exhausted, continued to resist. Constantinople had not yet reached its breaking point. But the pressure was still increasing, and the system that had protected the city for centuries was being pushed closer to its limits. And beyond the walls, the Ottoman forces prepared for the moment when those limits would finally be reached. The final moments did not arrive with silence, but with a sudden, overwhelming surge of force that broke the rhythm of the siege. For weeks, Constantinople had endured the steady pressure of bombardment, repair, and resistance. But when the last assault began, it was different. It was no longer measured. It was relentless. Before dawn, under the cover of darkness, the Ottoman forces advanced in waves toward the weakened sections of the wall. The ground itself seemed to tremble beneath the movement of thousands of soldiers pressing forward at once. The breaches that had been held for so long were tested beyond their limits. Defenders rushed to their positions, exhausted but resolute, knowing that this would be the decisive moment. The walls, once symbols of permanence, were now fractured, their strength diminished by weeks of sustained assault. And this time they could not hold. The first lines of defense collapsed under the pressure. What had once been a barrier became an opening. Ottoman forces poured through the breaches, not as scattered attackers, but as a coordinated surge that moved quickly into the city. Resistance continued, but it was no longer able to contain the advance. The structure of defense that had held for centuries unraveled in hours. Fighting spread through the streets of Constantinople, moving from the outer defenses toward the heart of the city. The narrow alleys and familiar pathways that had once carried daily life now became spaces of conflict. The defenders, though still resisting, were overwhelmed by numbers and momentum. The city, which had endured countless sieges, was now facing something it could not reverse. At the center of it all stood Hagia Sophia. As the city fell around it, the great structure remained unchanged in form, its massive dome rising above the chaos below. For centuries, it had been the spiritual heart of Constantinople, a place where the identity of the city had been expressed in stone and light. Now, as the final resistance collapsed, it became a symbol of transition. The fall of Constantinople was not just the loss of territory. It was the end of an empire that had traced its roots back to ancient Rome. Emperor Constantine the last ruler of Byzantium, remained within the city as it fell, embodying the final chapter of a history that had lasted over 1,000 years. His presence, like the city itself, represented continuity until the very end. When the fighting subsided, the transformation was complete. Constantinople, once the capital of the Byzantine Empire, had become part of the Ottoman world. Its walls still stood, though broken. Its buildings still remained, though changed in meaning. Hagia Sophia, which had defined the spiritual life of the city for centuries, would soon be repurposed, marking the beginning of a new era. The city would not disappear, it would evolve. Under Ottoman rule, Constantinople would grow again, becoming Istanbul, a new center of power, culture, and influence. Yet the past did not vanish. It remained embedded in the stones of the city, in its layout, in the layers of history that could not be erased. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 marked a turning point far beyond its walls. It reshaped trade routes, influenced the movement of knowledge, and altered the balance of power between empires. It signaled the end of the medieval world in one region and the beginning of a new phase of history in another. But beyond these larger changes, the story of Constantinople remains deeply human. It is a story of a city that believed in its endurance, that relied on its past to guide its future, and that faced a moment when that past was no longer enough to guarantee survival. Standing at the edge of that final morning, just before the walls were breached, Constantinople was still what it had always been, a city of stone, faith, and memory. Its streets still held life. Its churches still carried the echoes of prayer. Its people still believed, even as the world around them shifted beyond recognition. And that is what gives its story its lasting weight. Because the fall was not simply the destruction of a place, it was the transformation of a world that had existed for over 1,000 years. A world that did not disappear, but changed, leaving behind traces that continue to shape history even now.